At 9 o'clock on the evening of Sunday, the 15th of August, 1971, President Richard Nixon sat before television cameras in the White House and began a speech that lasted 15 minutes. He had preempted a popular television program to do so. No foreign government had been warned. No allied finance minister had received a telephone call. No international institution had been consulted. When he finished speaking, the global monetary system that had governed every international financial transaction since 1944 was effectively over. The Bretton Woods system, built at the end of the Second World War to prevent the competitive devaluations and currency chaos of the 1930s, rested on a single promise: the United States would exchange any dollar presented by a foreign central bank for gold at $35 per ounce. 27 years of international trade, post-war reconstruction, and expanding prosperity had been built on that guarantee. On that Sunday evening, with 15 minutes of televised remarks, Nixon cancelled it. He called it a temporary measure to protect the dollar from international speculators. The gold window, he said, would reopen once the system had been reformed. It never did. Within 2 years, every major currency in the world was floating freely against every other. The era of fiat money had begun, not by election, not by treaty, by a Sunday night television address that most Americans watched and did not fully understand. By the mid-1960s, the structural flaw that Keynes had identified at Bretton Woods in 1944 and that Robert Triffin had formalized as an economic theorem in 1960 was no longer theoretical. Foreign holdings of US dollars had grown to nearly $50 billion. American gold reserves stood at $10 billion. The arithmetic was irreversible. If every foreign central bank that held dollars simultaneously demanded gold at the $35 rate, the United States could meet approximately 1/5 of those claims. The pressure had been building in stages. In February 1965, France's President Charles de Gaulle had announced his intention to exchange French dollar reserves for gold at the official rate, a deliberate political challenge to what he called America's exorbitant privilege. By 1966, non-American central banks held $14 billion whilst US gold reserves had fallen to $13.2 billion, of which only $3.2 billion was available to cover foreign holdings. The London Gold Pool, a consortium of 8 central banks that intervened in gold markets to hold the $35 price, collapsed in March 1968 under the weight of speculative demand. A 2-tier gold market was introduced as a stopgap, one price for official transactions, another for private markets. It held the line temporarily whilst doing nothing to address the underlying imbalance. By August 1971, Switzerland had already left the Bretton Woods system. West Germany had followed, and Britain, the country that had helped design the system at the end of the Second World War, had just requested that $3 billion of its reserves be converted to gold and moved from Fort Knox to the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. Paul Volcker, then Undersecretary of the Treasury for International Monetary Affairs, observed the request and reached a precise conclusion. If the British, who had founded the system with us and who had fought so hard to defend their own currency, were going to take gold for their dollars, it was clear the game was indeed over. Before we go further, if this kind of history matters to you, consider subscribing to the channel. Every video here is built around the financial decisions that actually changed the world. The crises, the policy failures, the moments when the system revealed what it was designed to protect. If that is the kind of analysis you want to keep watching, the subscribe button is how you tell us. And we want to hear from you. Did you live through one of these turning points? The 2008 collapse, the 70s oil shock, the end of Bretton Woods? Did it change your family's circumstances, your understanding of how money actually works? Leave it in the comments. The most complete record of these events is not in any official report. It is in the people who were paying attention. Now, back to the account. At 3:15 on the afternoon of Friday, the 13th of August, 1971, 15 men gathered in a lodge at Camp David, the presidential retreat in the Catoctin Mountains of Maryland. The meeting had been kept entirely secret. No announcement had been made. The participants had been instructed not to tell their own departments where they were going. Around the table sat the architects of American economic policy, Treasury Secretary John Connally, a Texan lawyer who had been appointed to the role 6 months earlier with virtually no background in international monetary affairs, but who possessed, in the words of those who worked with him, a political force that was difficult to overstate. Federal Reserve Chairman Arthur Burns, who had warned Nixon repeatedly that closing the gold window would destroy international confidence in the dollar and shake America's alliances. Paul Volcker, the one man in the room who had spent years inside the international monetary system and understood precisely how it worked. George Shultz, director of the Office of Management and Budget, a student of Milton Friedman who had long favored letting currencies float freely, and William Safire, Nixon's speechwriter, who was there to help craft whatever needed to be said. Notably absent, Secretary of State William Rogers, Henry Kissinger, the National Security Advisor. No one who represented the interests of America's allies had a seat at the table. The decision that would affect every economy in the non-communist world was made without any of those governments in the room. The sessions ran from Friday afternoon through Saturday and into Sunday. Burns argued against closing the gold window. Volcker worried about the reaction of foreign governments. Connally argued that it was precisely that reaction, the pressure it would place on surplus countries like Germany and Japan to revalue their currencies, that made the action worth taking. Nixon listened to all of them. He had already decided. Nixon's address to the nation on the evening of the 15th of August contained 3 separate economic decisions, each significant in its own right, presented as a coordinated package of protection for ordinary Americans. The first, and by far the most consequential for the international system, was the closure of the gold window. Foreign governments and central banks could no longer exchange their dollar holdings for gold at the $35 rate. Nixon framed this not as a retreat, but as a defense against speculators who were attacking the dollar. "I have directed Secretary Connally to suspend temporarily the convertibility of the dollar into gold or other reserve assets," he announced. The word temporarily carried enormous weight in foreign capitals that night. None of them believed it. The second decision was a 90-day freeze on wages and prices, the first such peacetime control in American history. Inflation had reached 5.84% annually. Unemployment stood at 6.1%. Nixon, whose entire political instinct ran against government intervention in markets, had concluded that the domestic political cost of inaction was higher than the ideological cost of control. The third was a 10% surcharge on all dutiable imports. This was Connally's instrument, a blunt economic weapon designed to force surplus countries, primarily West Germany and Japan, to accept currency revaluation by making the alternative economically painful. No foreign government learned of these measures before the broadcast began. Tokyo heard the news at 9 o'clock on Monday morning, when the New York markets were already opening for the week. London heard it in the small hours of Sunday night. Paris received no advance notice at all. The French Finance Ministry described the announcement as an act of monetary aggression. John Connally subsequently told a gathering of European finance ministers what the American position amounted to. "The dollar is our currency, but your problem." The international response was immediate and chaotic. In Tokyo, the Bank of Japan intervened on the 16th of August, the day after Nixon's speech, buying $1.3 billion to prevent the yen from appreciating against the dollar. Within a week, Japan's foreign exchange reserves had swollen to $2.7 billion. Within a fortnight, to $4 billion. The intervention could not hold. The yen appreciated anyway. Currency markets that had operated under fixed exchange rates for 27 years now faced the question they had never been designed to answer. What is a currency worth when it is no longer anchored to anything external? The answer that emerged from the chaos of August and September 1971 was that it was worth whatever the market decided, and the market, discovering this freedom for the first time, moved with extreme volatility. In December 1971, representatives of the 10 leading industrialized democracies gathered at the Smithsonian Institution in Washington in an attempt to reconstruct a fixed exchange rate system from the wreckage of Bretton Woods. Nixon, ever alert to the political value of a grand gesture, described the Smithsonian Agreement as the most significant monetary agreement in the history of the world. It was not. The new exchange rates it set lasted 15 months. By February 1973, speculative pressure had forced a further devaluation of the dollar. Several weeks later, the major currencies were floating. Bretton Woods was over, not only in practice but in fact. The petrodollar system that emerged from the ruins deserves its own account and will receive one. For the purposes of this episode, what matters is that the dollar retained its reserve currency status after 1971, not because of the gold guarantee, that was gone, but because of the network of institutions, contracts, commodity markets, and military relationships that had been built around it since 1944. The anchor changed, the edifice remained. The Nixon shock created winners and losers, and the distribution was neither fair nor random. In the United States, the immediate domestic reaction was positive. Nixon's approval ratings rose after the speech. The wage and price controls temporarily reduced inflation, which Americans had found disorienting after decades of relative stability. The Dow Jones Industrial Average gained 33 points on the day after the announcement, its largest single-day gain in history to that point. Americans were told they had been protected from foreign speculators. Many believed it. What followed was rather more complicated. The end of dollar-gold convertibility removed the constraint that had, for 27 years, prevented the United States from running unlimited deficits. Without gold discipline, the money supply could expand without reference to any external limit. The inflation that had seemed to prompt the crisis did not disappear. It accelerated. By 1973, inflation in the United States had reached 8.7%. By 1974, 12%. By 1979, 13.3%. The Great Inflation of the 1970s, one of the most economically destructive periods in post-war American history, was in part the consequence of what happened in that White House broadcast on the 15th of August, 1971. For developing nations that relied on commodity trade denominated in dollars, the abandonment of the gold standard meant their terms of trade were now determined by American monetary policy decisions over which they had no influence. When the Federal Reserve later tightened policy dramatically to break the inflation cycle, the dollar strengthened sharply, and the debts of developing nations, denominated in dollars, became suddenly and catastrophically more expensive to service. The Latin American debt crisis of the 1980s has roots that run directly back to Camp David in August 1971. Paul Volcker, who had been in that room, who had worried about the consequences, who later, as Federal Reserve Chairman, broke the inflation cycle with interest rates that peaked at 20% in 1981, reflected on the unanchored system he had helped create. In 2011, he said simply, "Nobody's in charge. Every dollar in existence today is a direct consequence of what Nixon announced on the 15th of August, 1971. Not in the sense that the dollar began that night. It had existed since 1792, but in the sense that the dollar you hold, spend, and earn is a fiat currency. Money whose value rests not on any physical commodity, but on the institutional credibility of the United States government and the Federal Reserve. That transition happened in 15 minutes on a Sunday night, without a vote, without a treaty, without the consent of any foreign government or any American citizen outside that West Wing. The system that replaced Bretton Woods was never formally designed. It emerged from the decisions of 1971 to 1973 as a de facto arrangement, major currencies floating against each other, the dollar retaining reserve status through institutional inertia, commodity markets, particularly oil, denominated in dollars by convention rather than law. It was a system that suited the United States and disadvantaged nations that could not print the world's reserve currency. Nixon resigned from the presidency in August 1974 over the Watergate scandal, a year and 2 days after the Smithsonian Agreement that was supposed to save Bretton Woods had collapsed. Connally left government and returned to Texas, where he eventually declared personal bankruptcy in 1987. Paul Volcker served as Federal Reserve Chairman until 1987 and spent his remaining years warning about the fragility of an international monetary system with no fixed anchor. The question of what the dollar's reserve status depends on and how long it can last is not a question this episode can answer, but it is the question that the events of Camp David in August 1971 made unavoidable. Every subsequent debate about global financial architecture, about BRICS, about digital currencies and gold, about the sustainability of American deficits, every one of those debates is a continuation of the argument that began in a mountain lodge in Maryland on a Friday afternoon in August 1971, when 15 men decided the fate of the world's money without telling anyone. If this account has given you a clearer understanding of how financial power actually operates, subscribe to the channel. There are more crises, more decisions, more turning points still to document. And if this period of history connects to something you lived through or something a family member witnessed, the bank runs, the inflation, the austerity, the moment a system everyone trusted stopped working, tell us in the comments. What did they see? What did it cost them? What did they believe afterwards? The official version of these events is always written by the institutions that survived them. The fuller version belongs to the people who did not.